My name is Kwame Owino, and I'm glad to have this opportunity to share my thoughts about the subject today, which is basically the national economic policy in Kenya and what are the moral safeguards for securing Kenya's future. So this is the outline. I'll start with obviously very basic definitions. Then I'll talk about the state of play, because my thinking is that the state of play of economic management in Kenya is important to talk about what kind of moral imperatives apply and what safeguards are required. And then I'll cite, I am conscious that many economists and scholars have talked about the convergence between human welfare or human development and some moral principles. I'll cite some information from my interpretation of some information from Adam Smith, and obviously then Benjamin Friedman. So between those two is almost 250 years of economic, social policy, and political thinking. And I do that to emphasize the fact that this question has been debated, and there's been a lot of thought that has been recorded about it by a whole number of very eminent scholars. And then the final part, the fourth part is basically to talk about having identified the state of play and talked about some principles or identified some streams of thought. I would apply those to Kenya by asking about, given the challenges that Kenya has, what are the moral imperatives for Kenya's economic prosperity? And I'll make a conclusion. So simply, in terms of definitions, I ask a very simple, almost idiotic question: what are moral safeguards? And my personal answer is that these would be reducible rules of thumb or principles that should apply to all human relations within a polity. So basically, those moral safeguards would be what members of a society agree as important and we justify coming together to pursue. Now, I say that the safeguards themselves are unimportant. Their importance comes from the fact that they generate consequences which many people are prepared to coalesce around. By saying, for instance, that we come together as Kenyans, that we may be secure, we may be prosperous, we may have healthy lives and stuff like that. Now, one of them that I think pervades many societies is that seeking broad prosperity and welfare improvement therefore becomes a moral obligation. It is unlikely that a political entity would exist whose statement would be that we are actually seeking to reduce public welfare and we are actually seeking to reverse prosperity. In as much as historically there have been what people call civilizations, nations that have risen and gone back. Even at the apex and when they began their decline, those who ran them were still very conscious, or rather still argued consciously that they were seeking the prosperity of their people. And many societies sometimes in their decline do not even realize. They continue to pursue things because nobody consciously says that I'm seeking to be less prosperous and I'm seeking to diminish welfare improvements. In as much as, of course, we know societies that sometimes seek to improve the welfare of certain people or certain classes at the expense of others for political or other reasons. So that's a broad definition, which is basically that moral safeguards, people agree upon them, and they're the function of putting together society. They provide part of the rationale for political entities. And I would think that for that reason, broad prosperity and welfare improvements become a moral obligation for a society. It is unlikely that people could congeal or come together and have agreements that are related to actually reversing any progress. But at the same time, we know that sometimes decline takes place, but that decline does not necessarily take place because people don't think, have consciously chosen it. They might be deluded in using methods and using objectives that are not the correct ones in the belief that they'll actually achieve prosperity. I come now to the state of play in Kenya because I'd like to overlay the moral imperatives that we speak about on what the real questions in Kenya are. One of them is, obviously, as you see here, is a picture that tells us about a 6-year trend line in income growth. In Kenya shillings, I think to get a possibly benchmark globally would be to divide this number by about 104 or 105. So what we can see is that Kenya's income growth has been taking place over the last 6 years. My claim would be that is consistent with us, our moral foundation. Now, whether it is achieved by accident or purposely is a different matter altogether, but I claim that to the extent that this growth is happening in the income per person, the trend is pointing towards more moral society at the national and at the aggregate level. I also need to emphasize that the morality that we speak about is not personal morality, but it's a morality that brings together upon which people agree what kind of pursuits will society together dedicate its resources, dedicate its treasure towards the achievement of. So this has been happening, and of course in 2020, for many reasons, one of them being the rise of COVID-19 infections globally and its spread into pandemics, meant that there were shocks to many global economies, Kenya being one of them, and in some parts of the world, there were more significant drops in income than you'd have here. I am also conscious that this distribution of income, this growth in income is not necessarily representative of its distribution. It does not necessarily mean that everybody's income was at this level. It also does not address whether inequality grew, which might be also a normal or a normative question. But on the whole, what it is showing is that the progress of this society, seen from the lens of income, seems to be on the positive line, though shocked by the 2020 pandemic. The second issue is one of public debt. We have seen in the last chart 4 the growth low by global standards. Kenya is just basically considered a middle income country with an income per capita of less than $2,000 per person. It's low, but remember, about 15 years or 20 years ago, it was at close to half of that. So some progress has been made, and that progress is consistent with the claim that society is pursuing moral objectives, which are founded upon trying to lift the welfare of its citizens. So here we see a growth on the left side, in the green chart, trend line rather, you see growth in public debt. So this is debt basically taken by the government of Kenya on behalf of its citizens. This growth has grown, this is nominal definition, so it's grown from about 500 billion shillings all the way to closer to 8.5 trillion by the end of 2020. Taken on its own, it doesn't tell you much, but at the same time, it's showing that it's consistent with, rather, there's some growth in income per person, but at the same time, the government of Kenya is attracting obligations which would require that the people pay for. So when you put these two together, one, rising public debt, on the other side is growing incomes, then we have to say that yes, while the incomes are grown, there's an obligation that the public bears on account of owing some income or owing some treasure and property to other people, whether they be domestic in terms of Kenyan institutions, individuals, or whether there are other people who are lenders to government, regardless of what their nationality might be. The second part is basically the same representation of those sums, but this time represented as a share of total income or the gross domestic product per year. And one can see 3 phases. The first is the green part, basically, which is a KANU regime and an administration in Kenya, with a peak in income, or rather in debt, as a share of all total income of about 63% by 2002, by the end of 2002. In 2003, a new administration took in a very sharp reduction in that indebtedness, national indebtedness, all the way to about 2007, 2008, and then it flatlines and rises quite a bit towards 2012. A new administration takes up and obviously shows one of the most radical expansions in public debt in Kenya, for many reasons, one of them being that this administration had an ideological pursuit, or rather, this administration, like all the others, the picture of its expenditure in terms of total debt reflects the ideological belief that it pursued. One of them is that for the red side, and red is just arbitrary assignment of color. The red side shows that this was heavy investment in infrastructure and public works in general. So that's basically it. So incomes have grown, total public indebtedness has grown, but not only grown, that there's been a radical change in public debt in 2014 to 2021, and this is ongoing. Its consequences are already being felt. Government of Kenya is in a debt distress situations. I come now to the employment picture. So we've come from income, we've gone to the public debt, and now employment. So what we see here are 3 quarters, and it's to illustrate a point. Quarter 3 of 2019, which is basically the 3rd quarter of the year, the 2nd quarter of 2020, and the 3rd quarter of 2020. So basically what these are to show are the employment status of Kenyans, working Kenyans, or people who are in working age. So the first, in the first column, we see 3 definitions. One is the unemployed. The strict definition of unemployed is basically only people who are unemployed because they are seeking work actively, but they cannot find it and cannot do more than a certain number of hours per month. So that's 994,000 people in quarter 2 of 2020, right in the thick of the COVID-19 squeeze. The figure nearly doubled to 1.8 million. And then obviously came down in quarter 3 of the same 2020 on account of the fact that the restrictions and the pressure from the COVID shock were beginning to ease. What is still essential is that if you compare quarter 3 of 2019 to quarter 3 of 2020, leaving aside the outlier in quarter 2 of 2020, nearly 500,000 people more were unemployed 1 year later than had been before, suggesting that if progress, as we define it, economic progress in terms of fast work, giving the opportunity for people to work and the incomes that we spoke about, there were many more people outside work, 50% more outside work at the end of quarter 3 2020, showing that some of these have definitely other consequences for people's lives, but also as a moral barometer, it's showing that some new pressures are beginning to show, to which the moral lenses and the moral imperatives might be required. In that same trend line, it shows the unemployment rate over those periods. So basically 5.3, decent in comparative terms, doubled to 10.4 in quarter 2 of 2020. And then towards quarter 3 of 2020, it went to 7.2. So what it means is that there's not been a restoration of the earlier period, suggesting that there's some momentum for quite some difficulty, whether at individual levels or some families. Now, the final picture, the bottom of the picture in the first column shows unemployment in terms of the potential labor force. And the only difference between this and the strict definition is because this includes everybody in the working age who did not have a job, irrespective of whether they were in work or whether they were in school, and whether they're looking for work or not. They might have reasons not to. And so you can see, again, the same figure, 2 million more people on account of the shock in quarter 2 2020. There's been a reduction in the number of the unemployed in terms of the potential labor force, the total potential labor force, but you can still see that it hangs fairly loosely. So we've shown that income growth was happening. There was a shock, which this picture confirms, and the Kenyan government is very heavily publicly indebted. I come down to now basically going through very, very quickly through what are the moral lenses that I use, or what are some of the background to some of the moral lenses that we'll be using to analyze Kenya's economic policy imperatives. So I refer to Adam Smith, the British economist, basically wrote the theory of moral sentiment, of course wrote the classical text, which is basically The Wealth of Nations. His first book, obviously, in 1759, is The Theory of Moral Sentiments. And I summarize what I think it tells me that is essential to the argument that I'm making today. And he argues that there are some characteristics innate to the human nature that determine our moral posture of people and society. And then he emphasizes core values. Among those core values that are essential to people's prosperity or moral sentiments, are core moral sentiments would be prudence. I think that's true. Justice and economy. And these three, they're not the only ones, but they are only ones I highlight, are essential because they're important for society to operate under stability and with an improvement of people's public welfare. People's welfare. So the core, the essence of this, as I understood it, is how common moral sentiments affect prosperity. And you add to that the question of compassion. So Smith argues with himself across those, coming to the idea about why those core values are important, saying that some of those are not necessarily created, but they are innate to women and men, broadly. I would like to add to that my view about that is that Smith seems to be thinking about freedom at the national level. So government should allow for people to have freedom, and that government itself or society broadly should show good judgment about what's important for people and what's important for the outcomes that matter to people's lives. So very briefly, I come down to Benjamin Friedman, professor of economics, teaches at the Harvard Law School. Harvard School of Harvard University, the Department of Economics. He wrote a book called The Moral Consequences of Economic Growth, published in 2005. I think this is a classic. I'd like to see it in more curriculums than I do. But his claim is that a society's moral health runs parallel to its economic strength. Remember, by talking about society's moral health, he's not talking about the individual attributes of citizens. He's talking about what citizens agree on in general, and which many of them are prepared to place their labor on and see as responsibilities of the state. The implication of is that in the enduring prosperity in society is not achieved by accident. And that a society does not achieve its own prosperity by accident. It is actually the result of one of the things that people can agree upon and pushing together towards that, or settling institutions and rules towards those and persistently pursuing them. Remember, the consequences is more important than whether the rule itself is immediately functional. And his claim, as I read, is that the social level morality, not the personal one, leads to growth and moral progress, and these reinforce sustained progress. So basically what he's saying that societies are not prosperous by chance, but he's not making the claim that societies that are more prosperous are at individual level more moral than others, in the sense that two societies might have different income levels. And the one that is most prosperous also seems to show that basically at the public sector level and in public ethos has more moral cause that people are prepared to fight and push for. And another one, which is less prosperous than this, would show, all factors considered, not necessarily less morality at individual level, but less morality at government level. And that's true. Governments that are poorer sometimes tend to be also more corrupt, more brutal with citizens, less caring, and obviously get away with much, much more than governments that have a strong moral core, a democratic culture, and all that. So it's not to argue necessarily for political preferences. It's to simply show that the results that we see also reflect the preferences and the moral core that these societies have worked at. Now, that's a mistake. It should be moral societies tend, therefore, to have pro-social legislation that increase growth rates and also expand distribution of economic opportunity. So, for instance, moral societies, again, at the macro level, the outcomes that they see are outcomes that increase growth rates, expanding incomes and expanding prosperity, but also those growth rates take place in a way that actually ensure that they are reinforcing the moral core of that society. And they distribute opportunity to other people, so that you find that many societies that are prosperous are not societies that keep other people by trying to generate, by ultimate design, reinforcing differences in those societies. While he stated this, Benjamin Friedman was very conscious that, look, being an American, he has to consider what many people call, or President Obama has called, some regional sin, which was the question of slavery and, of course, inadequate protection of the rights of women and even children. That progress has been made over time, and his view is that that progress also was reinforced, and that the US government's and the US as a society's prosperity is a reflection of that moral journey. And that as the quality of the moral ethos improved in the public sector, the social outcomes did improve in a way that reinforced that forward movement by expanding economic opportunity. Fairly sensible. So I come down now to Kenya and asking myself, what are the moral imperatives? Remember, I identified some of the big problems, the questions of managing Kenya's public debt, ensuring stable incomes, because I think welfare growth is important, and one of the ways of measuring it very accurately is what income people have in order to ensure that they're not destitute and do not live lives of misery. And of course, the final one was basically the ability to actually work meaningfully, which is basically morally strengthening, but also reinforces division of labor, specialization, which is one of the principles that both Benjamin Franklin and Adam Smith acknowledge as essential. So what are those moral imperatives or safeguards? I think that given the state of play in Kenya, I think one of the principles that the government of Kenya and citizens should seek is that government allocation must be focused on people's needs. So the prioritization of government away from, say, white elephants and ostentatious expenditure is usually a reflection that the government is not seeking. So we know that on this continent and in Kenya particularly, people who work in the public sector, whether they hold political office, and I think there's an obsession with members of parliament because they lead some of the most flashy lives, but in general, the way the public sector workers, especially those who work at managerial level, are pampered, reflects disregard of people's public needs. If some nurses in hospitals, for instance, do not have adequate cover to ensure that they're not able to, that they cannot treat patients without necessarily being infected with disease, as we saw during COVID-19, while whether it's a speaker, people in the public sector, even judges, ride some of the most expensive limousines that you can buy globally. That suggests some moral fracture. I think profligacy and fraudulent conduct in public affairs are not moral. And profligacy is wasted, just talking about a little bit of this. Fraudulent conduct, which is corruption, a significant problem in Kenya's public affairs, are not reflections of morality. Now, many Kenyans say that they're not, but I do not see them necessarily as failures of morality of individuals. I see them as failures of morality in institutions and how we are not able specifically to ensure that there's a reduction in fraudulence and fraudulent behavior and in profligacy within the public sector. Wastage of public resources at all levels is just basically visible and reported every day. But for some reason, society is not able to come to a core by saying, look, while Kenyan students go to schools that do not have washing spaces, why is it acceptable then to have a person working in the public sector who has 3 cars available to him or her? Thirdly, I think we must judge public policy through the lens of effectiveness rather than intention. As I said, no society ever says that we have public affairs, or rather we come together as a polity to ensure that we do poorly. But many of the public policy choices that many governments take, and especially societies that are poorer or are not able to sustain growth, tend to be policies that simply reflect, or rather policies that reflect biases or policies that promise outcomes. And people judge them by virtue of the fact that we wish to support poorer people, we wish to support growth, we wish to support equality, as opposed to judging policies by the effectiveness. So effectiveness of policy is what we should concentrate on, because as we said, the moral lens is not necessarily about what you agree on. You agree upon the fact that these moral lenses are consequences, are instruments for reaching consequences that we like. So if we have a public expenditure pattern, and the government of Kenya has been spending huge money every year, and all it has left us with is a massive set of white elephants across the country because of the prestige of political leaders, then obviously that is failed public affairs. But more importantly, I would think that it does not meet the adequate moral approach that is required. So now I've talked about the principles broadly, and now I'm trying to think about what should we seek then. I think seeking economic growth and public prosperity is a moral imperative. That's saying the obvious. I know there are people who say that growth cannot be sought at all by all. Certainly, yes. But seeking the fastest, most efficient ways to grow an economy is a moral imperative. So an economy with people who earn 200,000 shillings per year, bringing up kids on those kinds of incomes, suggests that there's a huge set of things that people cannot even cover. So concentrating on the big goals that actually lift everybody and ensure faster growth is a moral imperative. Thinking about what the effects of vaccine what the effects of the infections, COVID-19 infections have had on incomes that we saw. My view is that in Kenya today, vaccination policy is both a health and economic recovery policy. How? The more people are vaccinated, the safer society becomes, the higher the chances that people will be able to work without infecting others or themselves getting infected. And the less they'll demand of a public health system, which is itself showing very significant stresses, not only because of being unable to accommodate ill people and actually cure them, but is actually losing staff because they're not provided with sensible protection to ensure that they're able to do their jobs without taking on undue risks. And the final one is basically causing poverty, discrimination, and imprudent economic management is state failure. In this continent, in Kenya, I mean in Africa, and in Kenya specifically, we think that we have a working state, we have police on the streets, we have a working army. But my view is that if incomes do not grow, if people die from recoverable illnesses, if people die from things that are preventable, and 3 weeks ago, this city was flooded after just one night of flash rains. And that too is a form of poor economic management, which is state failure, and especially state failure, both in concrete terms, but also in terms of moral lenses. So as I conclude, I'll say quickly, I have run through a very, very quick list, and there's a theory and evidence exists that family links public morality to progress. Remember, it's public morality and not individual morality. So what's the level of morality at the global level in Kenya? I think it's weak because it shows how people who benefit from abusing the public, benefit from public creating an inefficient state, get away with that. Economic growth and eradication of penury and destitution are questions of public level and not personal morality. I should add, and not personal morality. So people are not poor because their morality is weak, but they are because the global ethos that informs social behavior is not creating prosperity for everyone. Not because people are entitled to help from the state, but also if, for instance, the state does not control pandemics, which allows people to actually go to work or to let their kids go to school without the fear of getting ill, then obviously that's a failure of state performance. But we also think that's a failure according to our definition in terms of morality. The moral basis for economic prosperity requires an expansion of economic, social, and political freedom. So morality is about expanding people's economic, social, and political freedom. Thank you.